Before we begin this deep dive into one of the most tragic and defining events in American history, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy detailed historical storytelling. This narration will transport you to 1865, a time when the United States stood on the brink of peace, only to be shattered by an act of violence that shook the nation to its core. Well, let's begin. April 1865. The final days of America's bloodiest conflict. The Civil War, which had begun in 1861, was entering its last, agonizing moments, but the scars it had left across the nation were far from healed. The United States had been ripped apart by war, the ideals of Union and Confederacy clashing on battlefields soaked with blood, cities burned, families divided, and a generation of soldiers reduced to fractured men, haunted by what they had endured. What had started as a political dispute over the future of slavery had escalated into a total war, consuming everything in its path, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and an entire country struggling to redefine itself amid the ashes of destruction. By this point, the Confederacy was barely holding together. Their armies were starving, exhausted, and retreating, their infrastructure collapsing, their leaders increasingly desperate as Union forces advanced deep into their territory. The Confederates had once believed their cause was righteous, that they could defend their way of life, their economic system, their sovereignty. But now, as reality set in, they faced an undeniable truth: they were losing. The Union Army, under the command of Ulysses S. Grant, had relentlessly pursued General Robert E. Lee, tightening the noose around Richmond, the Confederate capital, pushing Lee's forces toward inevitable surrender. The grand Confederate vision of a separate nation was unraveling, and as April dawned, the war's final act was unfolding with terrifying speed. On April 9, 1865, in a small courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia, Lee did what had once seemed unthinkable. He surrendered. His forces, reduced to ragged remnants of a once mighty army, could no longer fight back, and the Confederacy's last hope crumbled in that moment. Grant, understanding the gravity of this surrender, did not celebrate it with cruelty, but instead offered lenient terms, allowing Lee's men to return home rather than facing execution or imprisonment. It was not a moment of triumphant victory. It was the quiet, somber end of a war that had already claimed too much. But even with Lee's surrender, the war's destruction did not simply disappear. Cities lay in ruins. Families mourned unimaginable losses, and the future of the country was uncertain at best. Slavery, the root cause of this violent division, had been abolished, yet the question of how the South would adjust to this new reality loomed. Over the reunification process. Would former Confederate states accept their defeat and work toward peace? Or would resentment fester, turning into bitterness, defiance, and resistance? At the heart of this chaotic transition stood President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had guided the nation through its darkest period, determined to rebuild not just the political structure of America, but its soul. Lincoln had spent 4 years carrying the weight of a country on his shoulders, enduring losses, defeats, setbacks, yet always remaining steadfast in his belief that the Union must be preserved. He understood that victory alone was not enough. Peace had to be crafted carefully, compassion had to be given, and the wounds of war had to be treated, not ignored. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks earlier, reflected his vision for reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he had declared a plea for unity, a promise that the North would not seek revenge, but restoration. Lincoln did not see the South as an enemy to be permanently crushed, but as part of the nation, ready to be stitched into the fabric of the Union. His leadership, his unwavering commitment to healing a shattered country, was perhaps the only hope for a future without further violence. And yet, as Washington, D.C. prepared for the task of rebuilding, danger still lurked in the shadows. In the capital, the mood was a mixture of exhaustion, hope, and bitterness. Victory had come, but at an unbearable cost. And not everyone was willing to let Lincoln's vision for peace become reality. Washington, D.C., in April 1865, was a city suspended between two realities: the exhilaration of victory and the lingering weight of war's devastation. The Civil War had defined every waking moment for 4 long years, shaping the streets, the conversations, the newspapers, and the very spirit of the people. Now, with Lee's surrender, the end seemed within grasp. But while some walked with newfound hope, others carried an unease that was not so easily shaken. The capital was not simply a place of celebration. It was a fragile space between war and peace, where exhaustion, joy, and bitterness blended into a complicated, uneasy atmosphere. Union soldiers drifted through the city, some returning as heroes, others haunted by the battlefields they had left behind. Their uniforms, worn and tattered, told stories of survival, but also of immense loss. Hundreds of thousands of men had perished, and those who lived bore scars that would never fully fade. Washington, though spared from the destruction that had ravaged the South, was still a war city. One that had been shaped by the conflict in ways that could not simply be undone overnight. Hospitals were still filled with the wounded. Streets still echoed with the whispers of families who had lost fathers, brothers, sons. The war might have been winding down, but its ghosts remained everywhere. The public mood was split sharply along emotional lines. For Northern supporters of Lincoln, victory was sweet but exhausting. They had given everything to preserve the Union, and now they looked toward the president with hopeful anticipation. They wanted an era of peace, a return to prosperity, a chance to rebuild without more death and destruction. But for others, especially those who had grown wary of war, of military orders and battle reports, the fatigue was too deep to celebrate. And among Lincoln's political allies, the question of what Reconstruction would actually look like loomed heavily. Lincoln, meanwhile, stood at the center of it all, the one man who had carried the country through its worst nightmare, who had fought to keep the nation whole despite impossible odds. He understood the depth of suffering the war had caused, and now he prepared to do what few leaders in history had ever attempted: to reunite a country that had tried to tear itself apart. His second inauguration speech, delivered just a few weeks earlier, had not been a declaration of victory, but a plea for peace, for unity beyond vengeance. He had spoken words of healing, of reconciliation, offering not a future built on punishment, but on restoration. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, was unlike any speech given by a wartime leader on the brink of victory. It was not a triumphant declaration, nor was it a promise of dominance over the defeated enemy. It was something far deeper, more introspective, and undeniably human. Lincoln had never been interested in revenge, and even now, with the Union's victory almost assured, his focus was not on punishment, but on reconciliation, on healing a country that had been ripped apart by war, bloodshed, and hatred. His words carried sorrow, acknowledging the horrors that had unfolded over the past 4 years. Unlike his first inaugural address, which had been delivered at the very precipice of war, this speech stood at its conclusion, reflecting on the immense pain both sides had endured. The devastation was impossible to ignore. Families destroyed, communities leveled, and entire generations changed forever. And yet, Lincoln did not call for retribution. nor did he seek to prolong the suffering of the South. Instead, he framed his speech as a call for unity, his famous words capturing the essence of his vision for America moving forward. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. It was not just a statement, it was a plea, one that set Lincoln apart from nearly every leader before him, a wartime president who refused to use victory as justification for cruelty. He knew that the southern states had been shattered, their economy collapsed, their people disillusioned, broken, and afraid of what would come next. If Lincoln had wanted to crush them completely, if he had sought to exact vengeance, no one would have stopped him. But he did not believe that America's future could be built on hatred. His speech spread across the country, reprinted in newspapers, debated among politicians, and read by those desperate to understand what the post-war world would look like. In the North, some saw his lenient approach with unease. There were voices calling for harsher consequences, for reparations, punishments, and a reminder to the South that their rebellion had cost them dearly. But Lincoln refused to be dragged into that mindset. His heart was with rebuilding, not just the infrastructure of the nation, but the trust that had been broken between its people. Yet not everyone welcomed his message. In certain circles, bitterness still festered. And there were those who saw Lincoln, not as a leader guiding the country to healing, but as the man who had destroyed their way of life. Among the ranks of Confederate sympathizers, resentment grew, their vision of America irreversibly shattered. And among them stood John Wilkes Booth, a man whose hatred for Lincoln burned like an unchecked fire, a man who saw the president not as a savior, but as a tyrant who had strangled the South into submission. Booth, an actor known for his charisma and dramatic presence, had long believed the Confederacy was righteous, its cause justified, its fight against the Union a noble resistance. But as Lincoln spoke of peace, of reconciliation, of rebuilding, Booth saw only betrayal, and in his mind, there was only one way to silence the president forever. A John Wilkes Booth was, in many ways, an embodiment of the turbulent era in which he lived. A man shaped by contradiction, consumed by passion, and ultimately driven by his own ideals to commit one of the most infamous acts in American history. Born on May 10, 1838, Booth was raised in Maryland, a state that sat on the border between North and South during the Civil War. Torn by conflicting loyalties and divided sentiments, his upbringing, steeped in the world of theater and Southern identity, gave him both a keen sense of drama and a deep connection to the Confederate cause, ultimately fueling his radical beliefs and his eventual descent into political violence. Booth came from a celebrated lineage of actors, his family renowned in American theater circles, particularly his father, Junius Brutus Booth, an English-born performer hailed as one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of his time. The Booth name was synonymous with stagecraft, talent and dramatic intensity, a legacy that John Wilkes Booth himself embraced from an early age. He trained tirelessly, seeking to carve out his own place in the theater world, and by his early 20s, Booth had become one of the most sought-after actors of his generation, performing in plays across major cities in the North and South. His commanding presence, striking features, and ability to captivate audiences made him wildly popular, earning him acclaim and a devoted following. But beneath the polished veneer of success, Booth harbored a deep resentment toward Abraham Lincoln and the Union cause. He viewed Lincoln not as a savior of the nation, but as a tyrant who had destroyed the Southern way of life, a man whose policies had led to the suffering and subjugation of the Confederate States. As the war raged on, Booth became increasingly radicalized, allowing his political beliefs to consume his thoughts, overshadowing even his thriving career. The defeat of the Confederacy, rather than bringing him peace, filled him with rage, and the surrender of Robert E. Lee in April 1865 was, in Booth's mind, the ultimate betrayal, the moment when his beloved South had officially fallen. Booth's Confederate sympathies were not merely casual beliefs, but deeply ingrained convictions that shaped his identity and his sense of purpose. He had long supported the Southern cause, actively opposing Lincoln's presidency, and denouncing the Union government in private conversations with friends and associates. He viewed Lincoln as the architect of the South's humiliation, a man who had waged war against a way of life that Booth saw as noble and worth preserving. And though the war had ended, Booth believed that Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction would erase the last vestiges of Southern identity, turning his homeland into a reflection of Northern ideals. In his mind, Lincoln was not just a political adversary. He was the enemy of everything Booth cherished. And so, as the dust of war settled and Washington, D.C. braced for the task of rebuilding, Booth's anger boiled into action. He could not accept defeat, could not allow Lincoln to complete his vision, and as his frustration deepened, his thoughts turned toward the unthinkable, the idea that Lincoln himself must be silenced permanently. John Wilkes Booth was never meant to be a shadow in history. He had grown up in the glow of the stage, born into a family where talent and theatrical brilliance defined their very existence. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been one of the most renowned actors of his time, a man whose performances captured the grandeur of Shakespearean tragedy with unmatched intensity. Booth and his siblings inherited that legacy, immersed in a world where drama was second nature, where emotions could be conjured with precision and controlled with mastery. His older brother, Edwin Booth, was widely regarded as the most gifted actor of his generation, performing for crowds that adored his skill and presence. John Wilkes Booth himself was no less captivating. He possessed a natural charisma, a magnetic stage presence that made audiences feel as though he commanded not just the theatre, but the very air around him. But where Edwin sought perfection in his craft, John Wilkes Booth found himself drifting toward political fervor, allowing his identity as an actor to become secondary to something deeper: his devotion to the Southern cause. His Confederate sympathies were not fleeting. They were entrenched in his soul, wrapped around his convictions so tightly that, by the time Lincoln was re-elected and the Union was assured victory in the war, Booth's resentment had evolved into an obsession. He believed, with unwavering certainty, that Lincoln's leadership had been a betrayal, not just to the South, but to the very foundation of American tradition. He saw Lincoln not as a unifier, but as a destroyer, a figure whose policies had dismantled the Southern way of life, forcing an entire region into submission under the Union. Booth despised the Emancipation Proclamation, viewing it not as an act of justice, but as the ultimate insult, a decree that stripped away the very institution upon which the South had built its prosperity. In his mind, Lincoln's push toward racial equality was an outrage, a violation of everything Booth believed America stood for. He saw the abolition of slavery not as progress, but as an attack on Southern identity, an unforgivable intrusion by the North upon the lives and traditions of the people below the Mason-Dixon line. Booth was not merely opposed to Lincoln's presidency. He loathed everything Lincoln represented, everything he sought to build in the wake of the Civil War. And as April 1865 approached, as the Confederate surrender loomed on the horizon, and Lincoln spoke of Reconstruction and healing, Booth's hatred deepened, turning into something darker, something that could not be quieted. His thoughts twisted toward vengeance, toward a belief that Lincoln's vision for America could not be allowed to succeed. And in Booth's mind, there was only one way to ensure Lincoln never had the chance to rebuild the nation he had fought so hard to preserve. John Wilkes Booth's fury toward Abraham Lincoln had reached a boiling point by April 1865. He was no longer simply a frustrated Confederate sympathizer or a man nursing ideological resentment. He was, by that time, consumed by his hatred, utterly convinced that Lincoln had betrayed America and had to be stopped by any means necessary. The surrender of Robert E. Lee had sent Booth into a spiral of despair. Confirming his worst fears, the South had fallen, its vision of independence crushed, and Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, racial equality, and reconciliation was on the verge of becoming reality. In Booth's mind, there was only one way to prevent that future from taking shape. The president had to die before he could solidify his victory. Booth had spent years opposing Lincoln, openly speaking against his presidency and expressing contempt for his decisions. But until the closing weeks of the war, his frustration had not turned into violent action. That changed after Lincoln's re-election in November 1864. Booth had desperately hoped for a turn in the war's tide, a moment where the Confederacy could strike a decisive blow and preserve its cause. But with Lincoln remaining in power, Booth saw no path forward for the South. He believed the Union would not only dictate the terms of surrender, but it would force a complete transformation of the Southern way of life, stripping away the traditions and societal structures that had defined it for generations. His rage deepened as Lincoln continued pushing forward his vision of racial equality, following through on his commitment to abolishing slavery and integrating freedmen into American society. To Booth, this was the ultimate crime, a violation of everything he believed America should be. He was a fierce white supremacist, someone who saw the enslaved population as inferior and unworthy of the freedoms Lincoln sought to grant them. The idea of black men voting, holding land, or participating in government repulsed Booth, and Lincoln stood at the center of that transformation. Booth had convinced himself that Lincoln was not merely a political adversary, but an existential threat to the future. He imagined for the South. His radicalism was not the spontaneous result of the war's final days. It had grown gradually, fed by his immersion in Confederate circles, Southern loyalist conversations, and the theater world's divided political sentiments. He saw himself as more than just an observer of history. He saw himself as an actor in it, a man who could influence its course through decisive action. And as his hatred hardened into an uncontrollable obsession, Booth began to form a plan. Lincoln would not live to see his Reconstruction dream fulfilled. Booth would make sure of it. But he would not act alone to bring his vision to life. He would gather a group of conspirators, men and women who shared his anger, his desperation, and his willingness to commit treason for the Confederate cause. His circle tightened around Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Herold, John Surratt, and Mary Surratt, figures who would become key players in one of the most infamous conspiracies in American history. John Wilkes Booth could not carry out his vision alone. Assassinating a president was no small feat, and the plan required careful coordination, secrecy, and men willing to risk their lives for the cause. As his hatred for Lincoln turned into a tangible conspiracy, Booth began assembling a network of accomplices, each chosen for their loyalty to the Confederate cause, their willingness to engage in treason, and their usefulness in carrying out a complex mission. This was not simply a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was a methodically crafted plot with layers of planning, backup strategies, and contingencies. Among Booth's closest allies in the conspiracy was Lewis Powell, a tall, imposing Confederate soldier who had fought in several battles before being captured and imprisoned. Powell was not just a fighter. He was brutal, unwavering in his commitment to the South. And when Booth approached him with the idea of striking against Lincoln, he readily agreed. His role in the plot would be one of the most violent and direct, an executioner willing to take whatever actions were necessary. Next was George Atzerodt, a man with none of Powell's physical prowess, but whose connections made him useful. Atzerodt was a known Confederate sympathizer, someone who had spent time helping Southern spies and operatives move through Maryland and Virginia undetected. While he lacked the ruthlessness of Booth's other recruits, he had access to secret routes, knowledge of escape paths, and familiarity with key locations Booth would need. David Herold was another key player, young, inexperienced, but deeply devoted to the Confederacy. His role in the plan was logistical. He was to act as a guide, ensuring that the conspirators navigated Washington, D.C. efficiently, assisting in their movements and helping with their eventual escape. While he was not a trained killer, his knowledge of the city and its surroundings would prove critical. Then there was John Surratt, the son of Mary Surratt, whose boarding house served as a gathering place for Confederate sympathizers. John was deeply embedded in pro-Southern circles, frequently traveling between the North and South carrying messages, supplies, and strategic information. His involvement in the conspiracy added a layer of legitimacy and connection to the Confederate underground, allowing Booth to build a stronger network around his plot. Finally, Mary Surratt herself was the central figure who provided logistical support, allowing Booth and his men to meet, discuss their plans, and store materials needed for their mission. She was not a fighter, not a direct assassin, but she played an instrumental role in enabling the conspirators, ensuring they had safe locations to gather and organize. Initially, Booth's plan was not assassination. It was kidnapping. His first idea was to capture Lincoln, take him as a hostage, and trade him for Confederate prisoners in a desperate bid to revive the Southern war effort. The plan, however, was complicated, risky, and dependent on multiple factors aligning perfectly. And as Booth's hatred deepened, as the South continued to crumble, he began to abandon the idea of kidnapping altogether, shifting his focus towards something far more permanent. Before John Wilkes Booth fixated on assassination, his initial plan had been centered on kidnapping, a bold, dangerous, yet ultimately misguided scheme meant to alter the fate of the war rather than bring Lincoln's life to an abrupt end. Booth believed that if he could capture the president, the Union could be forced into negotiations, offering Lincoln in exchange for thousands of Confederate prisoners of war, men who might reignite the fight and restore Southern resistance. It was a desperate idea, but Booth saw it as a last chance to turn the tide, refusing to accept that the Confederacy was beyond saving. The plan was complex, requiring perfect timing, secrecy, and absolute control over Lincoln's movements. Booth and his conspirators studied Lincoln's routine, his habits, and the locations he frequented, searching for the ideal moment to strike. Their aim was to capture Lincoln as he traveled, intercepting him during one of his carriage rides, where he would be unguarded enough to be taken swiftly and without immediate interference. The plot centered around a secluded road south of Washington, D.C., leading toward a known Confederate friendly region, where Booth envisioned smuggling Lincoln beyond Union reach. But the plan never materialized, falling apart due to miscalculations, logistical failures, and, most critically, the ever-changing nature of the war itself. Booth had underestimated how quickly events would unfold, failing to predict that by April, the Confederate army would be collapsing faster than he had anticipated. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, it became immediately clear that even if Booth succeeded in kidnapping Lincoln, there would be no Confederate leadership left to bargain with. The war was ending, the South was crumbling, and Booth's dream of a Confederate resurgence vanished before his eyes. With the war's end now certain, Booth abandoned the idea of kidnapping altogether. There was no longer a battle to win, no prisoners to exchange, no negotiations to be had. His obsession with Lincoln shifted violently, from capturing the president to ensuring that his vision for America was permanently silenced. If Lincoln could not be stopped by war, he would be stopped by death. And so, Booth turned to assassination, preparing to execute the most shocking act in American history. John Wilkes Booth had long convinced himself that Abraham Lincoln was the greatest villain in American history. The man who had destroyed the South, humiliated its people, and stripped away their sovereignty. But while Booth had initially clung to the idea that the Confederate cause could be revived through desperate measures, the fall of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox shattered any illusion that the South could somehow rise again. Every last hope that Booth had harbored for Southern independence, every fleeting dream that the war could turn in their favor, had been utterly annihilated by Lee's surrender on April 9, 1865. Now, there was no army left to fight, no strategy left to salvage, no last stand that could rewrite the inevitable conclusion. The war was over, and the South had lost. The full weight of that realization was devastating to Booth, pushing him into a state of rage, desperation, and obsession unlike anything he had ever felt before. Lincoln, the man Booth believed had orchestrated the South's downfall, was about to lead the country into a new era, one where slavery was abolished, where the Union was fully restored, and where Confederate ideals would be left to rot in the past. Booth could not stand it. He could not sit idly by while Lincoln cemented his victory. He could not watch as his beloved South was forced to accept defeat. And so, his thoughts shifted. If the Confederacy could not be saved, Lincoln himself must be stopped. Booth had once believed kidnapping Lincoln might be enough. A hostage exchange, a final act of defiance to turn the war in the Confederacy's favor. But now, the idea of taking Lincoln alive was meaningless. There was no Confederate government left to negotiate with, no army left to demand a trade. Lincoln was no longer just an enemy. He was an invader, a conqueror, a symbol of everything Booth despised. The only way to prevent Lincoln from shaping America into his vision of unity and equality was to end his life before he could fully enact his plans. And so, Booth's conspiracy transformed from one of kidnapping to one of assassination. It was no longer about holding Lincoln as leverage. It was about eliminating him altogether. With war no longer a battlefield struggle, Booth decided that the war must continue in secret, in the shadows, through the final act of rebellion that would leave the Union without its leader. The decision to kill Abraham Lincoln was not merely a tactical one. It was emotional, ideological, deeply personal. Booth saw himself as an avenger, a man who would strike down the tyrant, a Confederate loyalist who would not allow Lincoln to dictate the future unchecked. And in Washington, D.C., as Booth finalized his murderous plot, the last stronghold of the Confederacy, the capital of Richmond, was crumbling beneath Union boots, further sealing the fate that Booth so desperately wanted to escape. April 2, 1865, the day Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, fell to Union forces, signaling the ultimate unraveling of the Southern Rebellion. It was not simply a military victory, but a symbolic one. A moment that drove the final nails into the coffin of the Confederate dream, forcing its leaders and supporters to reckon with the unavoidable reality of their defeat. For 4 years, Richmond had stood as the heart of Southern resistance, a city that had embodied the ambitions, the defiance, and the desperate hope of the Confederacy. It had been the seat of government, the stronghold from which Jefferson Davis and his advisors had issued commands, plotted strategies, and dreamed of an independent Southern nation that would thrive in spite of Northern aggression. But as Grant's armies pushed forward, crushing Confederate forces, slicing through their defenses, and surrounding the city on all sides, it became abundantly clear that Richmond could not hold out much longer. The evacuation was chaotic, desperate, and painful. Confederate officials scrambled to flee, rushing toward Danville, Virginia, carrying what documents and valuables they could, leaving behind a city that was collapsing in real time. Fires spread, ignited by retreating Confederate soldiers, who attempted to burn warehouses filled with munitions and supplies to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But their recklessness led to flames engulfing the streets, consuming homes, businesses, and even portions of the Confederate capital itself. Smoke darkened the sky, and the very heart of the rebellion was drowning in ruin as its leaders vanished into the night, knowing they had lost. For Richmond civilians, the scene was one of heartbreak and terror. Confederate supporters, who had once walked with pride through the capital, believing in their cause, now faced the harsh reality of surrender. Some tried to flee, while others watched helplessly as Union troops marched through their streets, realizing that their way of life, rooted in slavery and rebellion, had come to an abrupt and irreversible end. And in the midst of this historic moment, Abraham Lincoln saw his vision coming to life. The war was finally reaching its close, the Union was triumphant, and the Confederacy was crumbling beyond repair. But Lincoln, ever the careful, deliberate leader, did not revel in the destruction. He did not see victory in terms of humiliation for the South. Instead, he saw opportunity, the chance to begin the Reconstruction process, to bring the shattered country back together, and to ensure that freedom was truly realized. With Richmond now under Union control, Lincoln made the extraordinary decision to visit the city himself, walking into the heart of what had once been enemy territory, determined to see firsthand the impact of the war's final days. He entered not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of the future, greeted warmly by freed slaves who had spent their lives in bondage, now embracing their first taste of liberty. They wept, they cheered, they reached out to touch the man who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, who had given them their freedom, and Lincoln, moved by their gratitude, spoke not of vengeance but of hope. Yet, for the remaining Confederate loyalists, Lincoln's presence was a bitter pill to swallow. They saw not a liberator, but an invader. The man who had destroyed the South, standing on their streets, speaking of unity, speaking of rebuilding. In their eyes, Lincoln was the very embodiment of Northern oppression. and his presence in Richmond was a reminder that their rebellion had failed, that their dream had been shattered beyond repair. Lincoln, however, was not there to gloat. He was there to begin the healing. But he would never get the chance to fully realize his vision. For in Washington, John Wilkes Booth was making his final preparations, ensuring that Lincoln would not live long enough to shape the future he had fought so hard to secure. Abraham Lincoln's visit to Richmond, just days after the Confederate capital fell to Union forces, was one of the most profound and emotionally charged moments of the post-war era. For years, Richmond had been the beating heart of the Confederacy, the center of Southern defiance, and the stronghold from which Jefferson Davis and his advisors had fought to break away from the Union. Now, with the rebellion crushed and the war effectively won, Lincoln walked through its streets, not as a conqueror, but as a leader seeking peace, restoration, and a new vision for America. His presence in the very city that had once symbolized Southern resistance was unimaginable to those who had lived under Confederate rule for 4 long years. The streets were filled with stunned silence at first, the news spreading quickly that the president himself had arrived, stepping foot into a city that had only days earlier been under Confederate control. And then, from the depths of the crowds, cheers erupted, not from the remaining Confederate loyalists, but from the freed slaves of Richmond, who saw Lincoln as their deliverer. Men and women who had spent their entire lives in bondage, who had known nothing but the cruelty of Southern slavery, now stood face to face with the man who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the leader who had given them freedom with a stroke of his pen. Some wept openly, some fell to their knees in prayer, and others pressed toward Lincoln, eager to simply touch him, as if ensuring that the moment was real. For them, Lincoln was not just a president. He was a savior, a symbol of hope in a world that had never given them justice. His arrival in Richmond was the realization of everything they had longed for, and their voices rose in praise, in gratitude, in overwhelming emotion that could not be contained. But among the remnants of the Confederate elite, Lincoln's presence was something else entirely, a brutal reminder of their failure, their humiliation, their complete defeat. To them, this was not an act of peace, but an act of intrusion, an invader walking through their fallen capital, speaking of rebuilding, of unity, of a future they wanted no part in. In hushed tones, they watched in bitterness, refusing to cheer, refusing to acknowledge Lincoln's presence as anything but an insult. Some could not bear to look upon him. Others whispered of hatred, of resentment, their hearts burning with anger at the sight of the man who had dismantled everything they had fought for. And far from Richmond, in the shadows of Washington, D.C., John Wilkes Booth heard of Lincoln's visit, and his fury burned hotter than ever. To Booth, this was no act of healing. It was the final proof that Lincoln was a tyrant, a man who had crushed the South and now walked proudly through the wreckage of what he had destroyed. This, Booth decided, could not stand. Lincoln had gone too far. He had to be stopped. Booth's rage deepened into something irreversible, the final push toward his ultimate act of treason. John Wilkes Booth had always seen himself as more than an actor. He was a patriot, a man who believed in the righteousness of the Confederate cause, and he carried that belief with a fervor that became increasingly dangerous as the war drew to a close. His anger toward Abraham Lincoln had simmered for years, but as the Union celebrated the fall of Richmond and the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, that anger transformed into something far more volatile. To Booth, Lincoln was no mere political adversary. He was a tyrant, a man who had torn the South apart, stolen its independence, and now stood poised to reshape the country under his own vision of reconstruction and equality. And Booth could not accept that future. Lincoln's visit to Richmond had been the breaking point. The moment Booth fully convinced himself that the president was gloating over the South's defeat. Even though Lincoln had entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a leader seeking to heal the wounds of war, Booth saw something entirely different. An invader walking through the ruins of Southern resistance, surrounded by freed slaves who worshipped him, while Confederate loyalists watched in disgust. To Booth, this was the final insult, the undeniable proof that Lincoln intended to erase every last remnant of Southern identity and rebuild the nation on his own terms, forcing Confederate states to submit to his vision without mercy. Booth's rage became uncontrollable. His mind fixated on the idea that Lincoln had to be stopped before he could complete his work. It was no longer about the war. It was about vengeance, about ensuring that Lincoln did not have the chance to shape the post-war future. Booth told himself that he was doing what had to be done, that history would remember him not as a murderer, but as a savior of the South. The man who had struck down the tyrant before his grip tightened on the country forever. And yet, as Booth's obsession deepened, Abraham Lincoln was experiencing something strange, something unsettling that he could not quite explain. In the days leading up to his death, Lincoln began having dreams. Eerie, haunting dreams that seemed to foreshadow the fate awaiting him. In the final days of his life, Abraham Lincoln was haunted by dreams that seemed to foreshadow his approaching fate. Dreams that would later be remembered as eerily prophetic. Lincoln, a man who had spent 4 years burdened with the weight of war, had always been open about his belief in dreams as glimpses into deeper truths. But the visions he experienced in April 1865 were different. They carried an unmistakable darkness, an unsettling feeling of finality that even he could not explain away. One of the most chilling dreams he recounted occurred just days before his assassination. Lincoln described wandering through the halls of the White House, moving from room to room in eerie silence, until he arrived at the East Room, a grand, solemn chamber where official gatherings and ceremonies were held. There, he found a coffin draped in black, surrounded by mourning figures dressed in sorrowful silence. Lincoln, bewildered, approached the casket and asked one of the guards standing nearby, "Who has died in the White House?" The guard turned to him slowly and answered, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln woke deeply disturbed, but as always, he treated his dreams with a mixture of superstition and practicality. He had spoken of death before, had even remarked more than once that he felt he might not live much longer, but he did not dwell on the dream for long. Yet as events continued to unfold, with the war ending and the country shifting toward an uncertain peace, Lincoln seemed to sense something lingering in the air, something inescapable, inevitable. There was another dream Lincoln experienced repeatedly, one he had come to associate with significant moments in history. He described a great rushing ship, moving swiftly through dark waters, carrying him toward an unknown destination. Each time the dream returned, something consequential seemed to follow: a battle, a turning point, a national crisis. And now, in the wake of Lee's surrender and the impending Reconstruction, he had the dream once more, feeling an unexplained certainty that something profound was approaching. Still, Lincoln pushed forward, focused on the work of rebuilding the fractured nation, of bringing reconciliation to a country torn apart by war. As Good Friday, April 14, 1865, arrived, Lincoln approached the day as any other, meeting with advisors, discussing plans for Reconstruction, and contemplating the future with a mixture of cautious optimism and exhaustion. That morning, Lincoln's mood was oddly light, more peaceful than it had been in years. He met with General Ulysses S. Grant, discussing the next steps for the reunification of the country, reviewing how to handle the remaining Confederate forces still scattered across the South. He spoke of his hopes for healing, reaffirming his commitment to bringing the nation together rather than punishing those who had fought against it. Throughout the afternoon, Lincoln had a series of meetings, including discussions with his cabinet, military advisors, and other officials working on Reconstruction policies. He was hopeful, energized by the idea that a new chapter was beginning. Yet even in those conversations, the remnants of his unsettling dreams remained. He made remarks about feeling wary, even hinting that he sensed something was coming. But he did not let those thoughts overtake him. As evening approached, Lincoln was encouraged by his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, to take a break, to step away from the burden of governance and enjoy the evening. She urged him to attend a play at Ford's Theatre, where the comedy Our American Cousin was being performed. At first, Lincoln hesitated. He had grown accustomed to his responsibilities overshadowing moments of leisure. But eventually he agreed. And so, the stage was set for that final, fateful evening at Ford's Theatre. A night where Lincoln would laugh, where he would sit among the citizens he had fought so hard to protect, where he would, for a brief moment, forget about the war before John Wilkes Booth stepped from the shadows and changed history forever. On Good Friday, April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln awoke to what would unknowingly be his final day, a day filled with routine meetings, discussions about the future, and a sense of cautious optimism that had become rare for a man who had spent 4 years burdened by war. The Civil War was effectively over. The Union had emerged victorious, and Lincoln now turned his attention toward Reconstruction, toward healing a fractured nation, bringing together former enemies, and ensuring the newly freed population would find its place in this new America. There was an undeniable weight on his shoulders, but there was also a rare lightness in his mood, something noticed by those closest to him. That morning, Lincoln met with his cabinet, discussing plans for the South, the handling of remaining Confederate leaders, and the next steps in reunification. He spoke not of punishment, but of leniency, of rebuilding, of moving forward with fairness. The bitterness of war, though still fresh in many minds, did not seem to linger in Lincoln's heart. He wanted peace, not retribution. He spoke with General Ulysses S. Grant, going over the surrender at Appomattox, pleased with the terms that allowed Confederate soldiers to return home rather than face brutal consequences. Lincoln had always believed that a harsh peace would only invite further division, and his focus remained on bringing the country together, even as some resisted his vision of forgiveness. Throughout the afternoon, Lincoln had several engagements, including discussions about the future of African Americans in the post-war nation, an issue that remained controversial among many, but one that Lincoln was committed to resolving. His Emancipation Proclamation had set the foundation, but Lincoln knew the fight for full citizenship and rights would be a long one. He was prepared for it, though he may never have realized just how short his time to shape that future would be. Despite his busy schedule, Mary Todd Lincoln encouraged her husband to take a night for himself, to escape the burdens of leadership, even briefly, to enjoy something simple. a night at the theater. Lincoln hesitated at first, reluctant to break away from his work, but ultimately agreed, settling on a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, an evening of light-hearted entertainment that he hoped would provide some temporary respite from the heaviness of war's aftermath. He had planned to attend with Grant, but the general declined, leaving Lincoln to go with his wife and a small group of guests instead. Meanwhile, as Lincoln carried out his presidential duties, far from his office, John Wilkes Booth was deep in preparation, finalizing his plot, ensuring every step of his plan would unfold as intended. Booth was not acting on impulse. His attack had been meticulously crafted, built on his understanding of the theater, his access to hidden passageways, his knowledge of how Ford's theater operated. He knew exactly where Lincoln would be sitting, knew exactly how to navigate the backstage without suspicion, knew the timing of the play, the moments when laughter would mask the sound of his gunshot. Booth was not just an actor, but a man who had spent years performing in Ford's theater. He knew its structure, its exits, its routines better than anyone. And on this night, that knowledge would become his greatest weapon. John Wilkes Booth was not an outsider stepping into Ford's theater. He was one of its own, a celebrated actor who had performed on its stage countless times, a man who knew its corridors, its passageways, its hidden spaces better than most. Ford's theater was, to Booth, a second home, a place where he had commanded audiences, where he had woven his performances into the fabric of its walls, and where, on the night of April 14, 1865, he would use that knowledge to carry out his most infamous role. Not as an actor, but as an assassin. Booth's understanding of theater mechanics, of stage entrances and exits, of backstage movements, was his greatest advantage. He knew when the actors would be distracted. He knew when the crowd would erupt in laughter. He knew which doors would be left unlocked, which routes would allow for a clean escape. His years spent performing in Ford's theater had inadvertently prepared him for this night, had given him the confidence to navigate the space with precision, ensuring that when the moment came, he could strike without hesitation and disappear before anyone fully understood what had happened. In the hours leading up to the attack, Booth moved with deliberate confidence. He studied the seating arrangement, confirming Lincoln's exact location in the presidential box, a space secluded enough to give Booth the advantage of a clear shot, yet open enough for the world to witness what he was about to do. He planned not just the act itself, but every movement that would follow, the escape route, the possible obstacles, the timing, all of it woven into his mind, like the script of a carefully orchestrated performance. But Booth was not alone in his mission. His co-conspirators, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Herold, had their own roles to play. Powell was assigned to attack Secretary of State William Seward, ensuring that the government was thrown into chaos, while Atzerodt was meant to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, though his nerves would ultimately fail him. The plan was a grand conspiracy, a night that was intended to cripple the Union government, to send the message that the war may have ended, but the South would not go quietly. And so, as the final moments of Lincoln's life counted down, Booth positioned himself within Ford's theater, readying himself for history. The play was underway. The audience was engaged. Laughter filled the room, and in the shadows, Booth prepared to step forward and fire the shot that would echo through generations. In the hours leading up to one of the most shocking assassinations in history, Washington, D.C. remained oblivious to the storm brewing in the shadows. It was April 14, 1865, and across the capital, there was an air of relief, of cautious optimism, as the war had finally come to a close, the Union victorious. People were beginning to look ahead, thinking of rebuilding, of returning to normal life, of stepping out of the darkness that had enveloped them for 4 long years. And at the center of it all, Abraham Lincoln carried the weight of the future, his mind filled with thoughts of reunification, justice, and peace. That evening, the president and his wife prepared for a night at the theater, something Lincoln had rarely allowed himself during the war. Moments of leisure had been few, often overshadowed by duty, by decisions that would shape the fate of millions. But tonight, he agreed to attend a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, hoping to find some joy, some laughter, some brief escape from the enormous task ahead of him. Lincoln's mood was lighter than usual, his conversations filled with warmth. And those who saw him that night would later recall how peaceful he had seemed, almost as if he had finally, for a fleeting moment, stepped away from the burdens he had carried for so long. But far from the warmth of the theater, John Wilkes Booth was making his final preparations, while the rest of Washington moved forward into a future shaped by Lincoln's victory. Booth was fixated on destroying that future before it could even begin. He had spent weeks orchestrating the attack, choosing the perfect moment, the perfect setting, the perfect execution. And Ford's Theater was his ideal stage, the place where he knew every hallway, every passage, every movement that would allow him to strike with precision and vanish into the night. Booth had no doubts, no hesitation. He believed his actions would cement him in history, not as a villain, but as a hero to the South, the man who had avenged the Confederate loss and ensured that Lincoln did not live to rebuild the Union. In his vision, he had planned his escape, his justification, his legacy, all of it tied to this final act, a moment he saw as nothing less than destiny unfolding. And as Lincoln took his seat in the presidential box, Booth steeled himself, feeling the cold certainty of what had to be done, knowing that within moments, history would be rewritten in a single flash of gunfire. Ford's Theater was alive with laughter, conversation, and the energy of an audience lost in the world of comedy. The play, Our American Cousin, was unfolding effortlessly on stage, the actors delivering their lines with perfect timing, drawing laughter from the crowd at each witty exchange. Lincoln sat comfortably in his box, surrounded by the elegant DA corps, positioned slightly forward in his seat, a subtle indication of his engagement with the performance. He had long been a fan of theatre, a rare escape from the weight of governing. And on this night, he allowed himself the luxury of enjoying the show, the worries of the nation momentarily set aside. Mary Todd Lincoln sat beside him, occasionally whispering observations about the play. They were joined by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, an invited couple who occupied the other 2 seats in the box. Outside the box, in the dimly lit corridors of Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth prepared to make history. He moved with ease, confidence, his footsteps steady, his expression focused, determined, unwavering. Booth had performed in this theater, knew its passageways intimately, had walked these halls as an actor, blending with the crowds, slipping in and out of rooms unnoticed. Tonight, his role would be different. Not a performer, but a killer, an executioner carrying out what he believed to be an act of patriotic revenge. As Booth approached the presidential box, he checked his pistol, a .44 caliber single-shot Derringer, ensuring it was ready, loaded, and capable of delivering the fatal blow. He carried a knife as well, An additional weapon should he need to fight his way out. Should something go wrong, should there be resistance he had not anticipated. He was prepared for chaos, prepared for the moment when he would fire the shot and the world would erupt around him. The play continued. The audience laughed. The actors played their parts, and Booth timed his approach perfectly. He knew the script, knew when the loudest burst of laughter would come, knew which line would mask the sound of the gunshot, which moment in the play would allow him to strike and disappear before anyone fully grasped what had happened. He reached the door to the presidential box, the wooden frame separating him from Lincoln and history itself. He took a breath, steadying his nerves, knowing this was it. The moment that would seal his fate, that would turn him from an actor into an assassin, from a man into a legend. And then, without hesitation, Booth slipped inside. John Wilkes Booth moved silently, slipping through the door of the presidential box at Ford's Theatre with calculated precision. It was a moment he had rehearsed in his mind over and over again, a scene so vividly imagined that it felt almost scripted, like one of the dramatic performances he had delivered countless times on stage. But this was no fiction. This was real, and in mere seconds, he would alter the course of American history forever. Inside the dimly lit box, Abraham Lincoln sat relaxed, leaning slightly forward in his chair, immersed in the play unfolding before him. He had no reason to suspect anything, no reason to look over his shoulder, no reason to anticipate danger. The war was over. The country was healing, and for the first time in years, Lincoln allowed himself a brief escape, a night of laughter and ease. Beside him, Mary Todd Lincoln whispered a comment, drawing a quiet smile from her husband as the scene on stage built toward a comedic climax. Booth, his heart pounding but his hands steady, raised his pistol. A small, single-shot derringer, carefully chosen for its concealability and lethal precision. He had one chance, one opportunity, to ensure that the shot would strike true. He lifted the gun, his finger tightening around the trigger. And in that instant, as the audience erupted in laughter at the funniest line in the play, Booth fired. The explosive crack of the gunshot barely registered over the noise of the theatre crowd, blending for a fleeting moment with the laughter, the dialogue, the rhythm of the performance. But within the box, everything changed instantly. Lincoln jerked forward slightly, his body stiffening as the bullet tore into the back of his head, driving its way through his skull, lodging behind his right eye. He did not shout, did not move, did not react. His body simply collapsed, his head tilting as his muscles lost all control, his consciousness slipping away in an instant. Mary Todd Lincoln's laughter turned into a scream, her eyes wide with horror as she realized what had happened. Major Henry Rathbone, seated in the box, reacted immediately, springing toward Booth in a desperate attempt to stop him, to seize him, to fight back. But Booth was prepared for resistance. With a swift movement, he dropped the pistol and drew his knife, slashing Rathbone deep across the arm, sending him reeling backward, blood spilling across the silk seats. Booth did not hesitate, did not falter. He had done what he came to do, and now he had to escape. As the realization rippled through the theatre, as gasps replaced laughter, as confusion turned to terror, Booth leapt onto the edge of the box, readying himself to make his dramatic descent. He turned, and before anyone could stop him, before anyone could fully process the horror unfolding, he sprang forward, dropping onto the stage below. And as he landed, rolling onto one knee, rising with theatrical flair, he thrust his bloody knife into the air and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis! Thus always to tyrants! The words rang out, an unmistakable declaration of what he had just done, of why he had done it, a final statement, before he would flee into the chaos of the night. Booth's voice echoed through Ford's theatre, his cry of, "Sic semper tyrannis? That's always to tyrants!" carrying across the stunned audience, ringing out like the final declaration of an actor delivering his closing lines. But this was no performance. This was real, and in that instant, as Booth rose from the stage, his knife raised high, the reality of what had just happened began to dawn on those witnessing the horror unfold before them. Booth did not hesitate. He had planned his escape meticulously, rehearsed it like one of his many dramatic exits on stage, and now, as the theatre erupted into chaos, he made his move, sprinting across the wooden floorboards with practiced precision. His right leg ached, a sharp, searing pain cutting through his adrenaline-fueled body, the result of his awkward landing when he had leapt from Lincoln's box. But he did not stop. He pushed forward, knowing that if he faltered for even a moment, the crowd would seize him, would drag him down before he could complete his escape. Behind him, Mary Todd Lincoln's scream pierced the air, shattering what little composure remained among the audience. It was a scream of pure terror, of unfathomable grief, the kind that comes not from fear alone, but from witnessing something irreversibly tragic. She grabbed at Lincoln's lifeless form, shaking him, pleading with him, calling his name as if her voice alone could bring him back, could undo the moment that had just unfolded. But Lincoln did not respond, could not respond. His body was slumped awkwardly in his seat, unmoving, his breath silent, his consciousness gone. Major Henry Rathbone, despite his wound, despite the blood dripping from his arm where Booth had slashed him, turned toward the assassin, his mind clouded with pain but sharpened by rage. He lunged forward, desperate to grab Booth before he could escape, but the commotion of the panicked theatre worked against him. The audience was moving now, screaming, standing, some rushing toward the box, others fumbling toward the exits, unsure whether they should flee or intervene. Booth tore through the crowd, his limp worsening, his breathing ragged, but his focus remained locked on the path ahead. He had planned his exit through the back of the theatre, a route that would take him to the alleyway beyond, where a waiting horse would carry him into the darkness. Each step was a battle against the pain, but the rush of his actions, the force of his conviction, carried him forward, his mind refusing to acknowledge the agony that pulsed through his body. Inside the theatre, pandemonium reigned. Some audience members had frozen in place, their minds struggling to process what had happened, unable to comprehend how a night of laughter had turned into a moment of national tragedy. Others shouted for help, for doctors, for anyone who might save the fallen president, their voices clashing in desperation, rising in an almost inhuman chorus of grief and horror. Outside, Booth pulled himself onto the saddle of his waiting horse, gripping the reins with a trembling hand, his body screaming in pain, but his mind burning with purpose. He had done what he had set out to do, had struck down the man he believed had betrayed the South, and now all that remained was the flight into the night, the final escape into history, the instant John Wilkes Booth's bullet struck Abraham Lincoln. Time seemed to freeze, then shatter into chaos. Mary Todd Lincoln's scream ripped through Ford's theatre, slicing through the laughter, the dialogue on stage, the hum of the gathered crowd, replacing all sound with the raw agony of a wife watching her husband collapse before her eyes. It was not simply a cry of shock. It was a wail of despair, an uncontrollable plea for reality to undo itself, for the moment to rewind, for Lincoln to wake, to breathe, to speak. But he did not move. He slumped forward, the very essence of his life silenced in an instant, his body heavy, lifeless, as blood began to stain the fabric beneath him. Ford's theatre, which had only seconds earlier been filled with warmth, joy, and entertainment, now erupted into chaos. Gasps rippled through the audience, shifting into cries of panic, shouts of confusion, feet stumbling over seats as people rushed toward the exits, toward the presidential box, toward any place that might offer clarity or safety. Some sat paralyzed, unable to process what had happened, refusing to believe that the leader of their nation had just been shot before their eyes. Others scrambled, reaching for assistance, calling for doctors, for security, for answers. Inside the presidential box, Major Henry Rathbone, his arm slashed open, struggled to steady himself, fighting through the pain as he leaned toward Lincoln, pressing against him, desperately. That the wound was not as severe as it seemed. But even as the shock clouded his judgment, even as he tried to find signs of life, he knew the truth. The president was dying. Below, Booth had vanished into the growing hysteria, slipping through the theater, disappearing into the darkened streets of Washington, his escape already set in motion, his path out of the city planned with ruthless precision. He had struck his blow against Lincoln, and as the Capitol descended into terror, his co-conspirators were executing their own missions, ensuring that the attack was not just an isolated tragedy, but a coordinated assault, meant to cripple the Union government entirely. In another part of Washington, Lewis Powell was stepping into the dimly lit bedroom of Secretary of State William Seward, his knife already drawn, ready to unleash one of the most savage attacks in history. The attack on Secretary of State William Seward was meant to be as swift and merciless as Booth's assassination of Lincoln, part of the larger conspiracy designed to cripple the Union government in one violent night. Lewis Powell, Booth's most ruthless conspirator, had been tasked with ensuring Seward did not survive, storming into the secretary's home with a cold resolve that turned into savage brutality. Earlier that evening, Powell had entered Seward's home under the false pretense of delivering medicine, exploiting the chaos and distraction of Lincoln's assassination to move unchallenged through the halls. He carried a revolver, but his weapon of choice that night would be a long, sharp knife, one designed for close, deadly encounters where hesitation meant failure. Seward, having suffered a serious carriage accident days earlier, lay weak and bedridden, his face bruised and wrapped in bandages, his body barely able to move without pain. The fact that he was helpless did not deter Powell. It made the attack easier, more inevitable. Powell burst into the room, his blade flashing in the candlelight, lunging towards Seward's throat with unrelenting force. But in that moment, fate intervened. Seward's son and bodyguards had suspected something was amiss, and as Powell attacked, a desperate struggle erupted. The room became a scene of uncontrolled violence. Powell slashing wildly, blood staining the walls and bed. The secretary crying out as the blade tore into his flesh, though not deep enough to end his life. Despite the chaotic resistance, Powell fought viciously, cutting down anyone who tried to stop him. But in the mayhem, he failed to land a killing blow on Seward, leaving the wounded secretary alive but drenched in blood. As panic rippled through the household, Powell fled into the night, his hands slick with the proof of his attempt, knowing his mission had partially failed. Seward lived, but the terror had been unleashed. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt, another of Booth's co-conspirators, was meant to carry out a third assassination that night. His target, Vice President Andrew Johnson, a man who was next in line to take over the presidency. But unlike Booth and Powell, Atzerodt was no cold-blooded assassin. He lacked the nerve, the precision, the resolve to see his mission through. Instead of executing his role in the conspiracy, he panicked, hesitated, and ultimately failed to make the attempt. Unlike John Wilkes Booth and Lewis Powell, who carried out their deadly missions with determination, George Atzerodt was plagued by hesitation and fear. His role in the conspiracy was to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, completing the plan to destabilize the Union government by eliminating its top leaders. But Atzerodt was not a seasoned killer. He was a reluctant conspirator, a man pulled into Booth's plot, but lacking the resolve to follow through with the violence demanded of him. On the night of April 14, 1865, Atzerodt arrived at the Kirkwood House, the hotel where Andrew Johnson was staying. He had a revolver tucked into his coat, ready for the moment he would enter Johnson's suite and pull the trigger. But as he approached, his confidence wavered. He lingered in the hotel bar, ordering drinks, trying to drown out the voice in his mind that screamed at him to walk away. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing moment, his courage disintegrated further. Instead of carrying out the assassination, Atzerodt sat nervously, drinking and talking to strangers, the weight of his task pressing heavily on him. Eventually, overcome with fear, he abandoned his mission entirely, leaving the hotel and disappearing into the city. His revolver never fired. His target never attacked. Unlike Booth and Powell, who would go down in history as violent conspirators, Atzerodt would be remembered only for his failure, for his inability to follow through on the act he had sworn to commit. Meanwhile, Booth was in motion, fleeing through the night on horseback, with his loyal accomplice, David Herold. The two men raced through Washington, slipping into the darkness, their destination set for Southern Territory, where Booth hoped to find refuge among Confederate sympathizers. His leg throbbed painfully from his fractured fibula, but he forced himself to endure it, pushing forward, knowing that every second counted. The streets of Washington were still in chaos, news of Lincoln's assassination spreading rapidly, but Booth had planned his escape too well to be caught in the initial wave of panic. The Union had lost its leader, and as Booth disappeared into the night, he believed he had struck the ultimate blow against the North, against Lincoln's vision, against the future he had fought so hard to build. John Wilkes Booth and David Herold rode hard into the darkness, their horses tearing down the dimly lit roads of Washington, carrying them further away from the chaos that was erupting behind them. Booth, his injured leg throbbing from the fracture sustained during his leap from the presidential box, clenched his teeth against the pain. He had no choice but to endure it. Stopping meant capture. Hesitation meant failure. The reality of what he had done was still settling into his mind, but his focus remained on escape, on the next steps of his plan, on ensuring he would never be caught for the act he believed would make him a hero to the South. Herold, less composed, more frantic, followed Booth's lead, guiding their path toward the rural roads beyond the city, toward Maryland, where Confederate sympathizers might offer shelter. They had arranged their escape route carefully, knowing they would need medical aid, safe houses, and time to disappear before federal forces could close in on them. Booth's pistol was gone, left behind at Ford's Theater, but his knife remained at his side, the blade still stained with Rathbone's blood, a grim reminder of the violence left in their wake. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the reality of Lincoln's condition had set in. He was not dead, but he was dying. A group of men carefully lifted his limp body from the theater, their expressions grim. Their movements slow as they carried the wounded president across the street to the Peterson house, a small boarding house where doctors would fight against the inevitable. His pulse was weak, his breath shallow, his consciousness slipping away. But they could not leave him to die in the theater, not in the place where laughter had so cruelly turned to horror. Mary Todd Lincoln followed behind, her face pale, tear-streaked, filled with silent terror, as she clung to the hope that maybe, somehow, he would survive. But those around her knew the truth. Lincoln would never wake again, and as he was laid in a small bed in the Peterson house, the nation's fate hung in unbearable suspense. Abraham Lincoln lay motionless, his body weak, his breath shallow, as he was carefully carried across the street to Peterson House, the small boarding home where doctors desperately fought against the inevitable. The president, the leader of a fractured nation, the man who had guided America through its darkest hour, was slipping away, and those around him knew there was no saving him now. Only waiting, watching, and mourning what was soon to come. Lincoln was laid on a narrow bed, barely large enough to fit his tall frame, his limbs awkwardly positioned as doctors crowded around him, trying to assess the wound, trying to decide if anything could be done. But the truth was clear. The bullet had shattered the back of his skull, tearing into his brain, leaving him beyond the reach of medicine. There was no surgery, no remedy, no intervention that could bring him back. The best they could do was make his final hours as painless as possible, to let him pass with dignity, surrounded by those who loved him. The small room grew heavy with silence, interrupted only by the sounds of Lincoln's faint breathing, the occasional whispered conversation, the muffled cries of his wife. Mary Todd Lincoln, overcome with grief, sat near her husband's bedside, her fingers trembling as she clutched his hand, whispering his name, pleading for him to wake up, for him to speak, for him to recognize her one last time. But Lincoln did not stir. His consciousness was gone, lost to the darkness created by Booth's bullet. Outside, word of the assassination spread through Washington, sending waves of shock and horror through the city. Government officials rushed to Peterson House, filling the corridors, standing in hushed groups, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief. Some wept openly, while others sat in somber silence, knowing that America was about to lose the man who had held the country together through war, through division, through uncertainty. Doctors checked his pulse, his breathing, his failing body, watching for any sign that he might linger longer, that he might defy the odds. But the hours stretched on, and Lincoln remained trapped in that fragile state between life and death, unable to speak, to move, to say goodbye. As the long night dragged into the early hours of April 15, Lincoln's fate became undeniable. The president would not wake again, and soon, the nation would mourn its fallen leader. Abraham Lincoln's final hours stretched through the night, each minute thick with unbearable grief. Each breath he took a fragile reminder of how close he was to death. The small room inside Peterson House, where he had been carried after the shooting, had become a solemn chamber, filled with the quiet murmurs of doctors, the muffled sobs of loved ones, and the heavy realization that there was no saving him. Doctors had done everything they could, but the bullet from John Wilkes Booth's pistol had been merciless, tearing into Lincoln's skull, destroying his brain, leaving no possibility of recovery. Still, they watched over him, measured his pulse, monitored his fading breath, their hands trembling as they conducted routine examinations on a man they knew would never open his eyes again. Throughout the night, Mary Todd Lincoln remained close, overcome with sorrow, unable to accept that her husband was dying before her eyes. She clutched his hand, whispered his name, pleaded with him to wake, begged for a miracle that would never come. Her cries were so agonizing that, at one point, doctors and aides had to gently remove her from the room, fearing that her grief would overwhelm the fragile atmosphere of Lincoln's last moments. Members of Lincoln's cabinet arrived, standing quietly, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief, waiting in the dimly lit room as the president fought his final battle against the inevitable. Some had tears rolling down their cheeks. Others stood motionless, hands clasped together, staring at the man who had carried the nation through its most turbulent years. The hours crawled by, and Lincoln's breathing slowed. His pulse weakened. The doctors whispered among themselves, exchanging grim looks as the minutes wore on, each one bringing Lincoln closer to the end. And then, as morning arrived, on April 15, 1865, at 7:22 a.m., Lincoln took his last breath, his body falling utterly still, his soul leaving behind the fractured nation he had tried so desperately to mend. The room was silent, except for the soft weeping that filled the air, the sound of grief finally breaking through. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, overcome with sorrow, lowered his head, whispering a single sentence that would echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages. As the early morning light crept into Peterson House, Abraham Lincoln's body lay motionless, his breath gone, his pulse vanished, his life now lost to history. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the 16th President of the United States succumbed to the wound inflicted by John Wilkes Booth, leaving behind a nation that had only just begun to heal from the war that had torn it apart. The room remained heavy with silence, the weight of Lincoln's passing settling deep into the hearts of those who stood witness to his final moments. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, eyes filled with sorrow, lowered his head, the significance of the moment pressing against his chest like an unbearable weight. And then, in the hush that followed Lincoln's last breath, Stanton murmured the words that would become immortal. Now he belongs to the ages. It was a declaration of Lincoln's place in history, a recognition that the man who had fought so hard to preserve the Union had now entered a realm beyond mortality, a place where his legacy would forever be etched into the fabric of America. But outside the walls of Peterson House, the world was waking to the unthinkable news. Lincoln was dead, and the nation was now thrown into mourning, into fear, into fury. Across the country, shockwaves rippled through cities and towns, spreading through newspapers, telegraphs, and hurried whispers between stunned citizens. People who had only hours earlier gone to sleep, believing that the Union had triumphed, that peace had finally arrived, now awoke to a reality stained by violence, where the leader who had guided them through war was suddenly gone. For Lincoln's supporters, the news was devastating, a wound that cut deeper than any battle, sharper than any loss. Crowds gathered in sorrow, some weeping openly, others standing in stunned silence, their minds unable to comprehend the sheer weight of what had happened. And for those in the South, Lincoln's assassination was met with mixed emotions. While some viewed his death as a tragic end to a man who had sought reconciliation, others saw it as retribution, the final strike in a war they had already lost. Yet even among former Confederates, there was uncertainty, a recognition that Lincoln had been their best hope for a fair peace, a future built on mercy rather than vengeance. But beyond sorrow and uncertainty, fury burned in the hearts of Union citizens. A righteous, uncontrollable anger at Booth, at the conspirators, at the forces who had dared to strike down their leader. And soon, Washington, D.C. would ignite in a desperate hunt for justice, as the pursuit of Lincoln's assassin turned into one of the most infamous manhunts in American history. The news of Abraham Lincoln's assassination spread like wildfire, shaking the nation to its very core. People awoke on April 15, 1865, expecting a country emerging from war, a union finally made whole again, but instead they were met with horror. Their president had been murdered. The shock was immediate, the grief unbearable, and across the country, an overwhelming wave of sorrow and fury erupted. Cities descended into mourning. Newspapers printed headlines soaked in black ink, announcing the tragic event in bold, unforgiving letters. The president has been assassinated. Crowds gathered in public squares, some weeping openly, others silent with disbelief. The Union, which had just begun to celebrate the end of war, was now draped in mourning cloth, its victory overshadowed by one cruel act of violence. In the streets of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and countless other cities, people dressed in black. Banners of remembrance hung from buildings, and public gatherings turned into mass vigils, as Americans struggled to process what had happened. Many asked how such a tragedy could have occurred. How could their president, who had led them through 4 years of war, be taken from them at the very moment peace was within reach? And while sorrow consumed much of the country, fury also boiled beneath the surface. Union loyalists demanded justice, calling for Booth to be caught and punished without mercy. Politicians spoke of retribution, of ensuring that those who conspired against Lincoln would be hunted down and made to pay for their crime. The North, once focused on healing, now focused on vengeance, determined to see that the man who had robbed them of their leader would not escape punishment. Meanwhile, plans for Lincoln's funeral began, and the process of laying the fallen president to rest took on a national significance beyond mere ceremony. It was decided that his body would be carried through multiple cities, allowing the mourning nation to say their final goodbyes, to stand in solemn tribute, to honor the man who had given his life for the country's survival. The funeral train, draped in black mourning cloth, would become a moving monument to Lincoln's legacy, traveling from Washington through the heart of the Union, making stops in major cities, before reaching Springfield, Illinois, the place where Lincoln's journey had begun. The funeral procession of Abraham Lincoln was unlike anything the nation had ever witnessed before, an unprecedented journey of mourning that spanned more than 600 miles, carrying the fallen president through the heart of the Union so that his people, his grieving, devastated countrymen, could say their final goodbyes. Lincoln's body was placed in a specially designed funeral train, its cars draped in black mourning cloth, its path carefully planned to pass through major cities, each one marking a solemn farewell to the leader who had steered the nation through its greatest crisis. It was a funeral not just for Lincoln, but for the war itself, for the era that had shaped him, for the loss that had changed the soul of America forever. Everywhere the train stopped, from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Philadelphia to New York, Albany to Cleveland, Chicago to Springfield, the scenes were the same. Crowds gathered in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, filling public squares, lining railroad tracks, waiting in unbearable silence as the train slowly passed through. Men removed their hats, women wept openly, children stood in quiet reverence, their young minds struggling to understand the full weight of the moment. In each city, Lincoln's coffin was removed from the train. Placed on public display in grand halls, surrounded by mourners dressed in black, standing in solemn tribute. The lines to see his body stretched for miles, winding through streets thick with sorrow, as Americans gathered by candlelight, holding vigils, speaking in hushed tones of the man they had lost. And as Lincoln's funeral train made its way towards Springfield, Illinois, his final resting place, something profound happened. He was no longer just a man, no longer just a president. He became something greater, something eternal. Lincoln became a martyr overnight, transformed by his assassination into the ultimate symbol of sacrifice, of unity, of justice, of a vision for America that now burned brighter than ever before. In death, Lincoln became larger than life, his legacy carved into history, his name forever attached to the ideals he had fought for: freedom, democracy, equality, and the belief that a nation divided could be made whole again. And though his life had been violently cut short, his dream of a united America did not die with him. It became immortal, carried forward by the very people who had once looked to him for guidance. In the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, his legacy transformed in an instant. What had once been a presidency marked by war, division, and political struggle now became something more profound, more lasting. Lincoln had become a martyr, immortalized not just in memory, but in the very soul of the nation. His murder had cemented his status as the savior of the Union, the man who had fought tirelessly for freedom, for democracy, for reconciliation, and whose death only amplified the vision he had tried to build. The grief was universal, overwhelming. Even those who had once questioned Lincoln's leadership now mourned him as a fallen giant, a figure whose absence left a void too great to be ignored. Newspapers printed his speeches anew, reminding the country of his words, his wisdom, his unwavering belief that a divided America could heal. The very ideals Lincoln had fought for, justice, equality, unity, became more powerful in his death than they had ever been in his life. But as the nation wept, the pursuit of his killer had already begun. What followed would become the largest manhunt in US history at the time. A relentless, 12-day chase for John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, convinced that he would be hailed as a hero in the South, expected support, expected refuge. But instead, he found himself hunted like an animal, moving through the darkness, fleeing deeper into Confederate territory, desperately seeking sanctuary in a war that had already ended. Federal forces spread out across multiple states, tracking Booth's movements, chasing every lead, questioning every contact, surrounding every known sympathizer. Roads were watched, bridges guarded, telegraphs filled with warnings of his presence, turning the escape into an ever-tightening noose around his neck. As Booth limped through the countryside, his fractured leg worsening, his confidence draining, he realized the truth. The nation would never celebrate him, never embrace him. He had not just killed Lincoln. He had sealed his own fate in blood. John Wilkes Booth fled into the night, his body battered, his mind racing, his pistol discarded, but his sense of purpose still burning within him. The streets of Washington were alive with terror, filled with shouts of Lincoln's assassination, the frantic movements of soldiers and civilians alike, all trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. But Booth did not hesitate. With David Herold by his side, guiding their escape, he pushed their horses forward, leaving behind the city that would forever remember his crime. For Booth, the plan had seemed airtight, an assassination that would shake the Union to its core, followed by a swift retreat into Confederate territory, where he expected to be celebrated, sheltered, protected. But the reality proved far different. Lincoln's assassination had not inspired a Confederate resurgence. It had ignited one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history, an operation so relentless that no road was safe, no town welcoming, no path free from watchful eyes. The federal government mobilized thousands of troops, detectives, and informants, searching every possible route Booth might take. Soldiers blocked bridges, intercepted letters, questioned civilians, determined to hunt the assassin down before he could disappear into the South. Posters bearing Booth's face spread across towns, announcing a reward large enough to tempt anyone who knew of his whereabouts. Every day tightened the noose around him. Every movement led him closer to discovery. With no clear path forward, Booth and Herold hid in swamps and abandoned barns, surviving on meager supplies provided by Confederate sympathizers. They avoided cities, changed routes, took shelter in places where no light could betray them. Booth's fractured legs swelled with pain, his body weakening as the days stretched on. But he refused to surrender, still clinging to the belief that he had done what was necessary. Yet as Union forces closed in, Booth began to understand the truth. He was not a hero, not a savior of the South. He was a fugitive, running from the inevitable reckoning. John Wilkes Booth and David Herold, exhausted, injured, and desperate, hid wherever they could. Swamps thick with mud and tangled undergrowth, abandoned barns where rats scurried in the corners, isolated farmhouses where Confederate sympathizers whispered hurried instructions before sending them on their way. Booth, his fractured leg worsening, found himself unable to move as quickly as he had in the first hours after Lincoln's assassination, forcing them to rely more heavily on those still loyal to the fallen Southern cause. Some provided shelter, food, even medicine, though with growing hesitancy. As the days stretched on, news of the massive manhunt unfolding across the country made even those sympathetic to the Confederacy fear for their safety. Booth may have believed himself a hero, but to most of the South, his crime was nothing more than a reckless act that had doomed any hope of a peaceful reconciliation. Still, for 12 days, Booth and Herold evaded capture, slipping between safe houses, relying on scattered support from Confederate loyalists, who helped them find shelter, ferried them across rivers, and provided just enough aid to keep them moving forward. Booth spent time writing in his diary, trying to justify his actions, convinced that he had fulfilled a great mission, even as the reality of his isolation, his injuries, and his dwindling options pressed in on him. But as Booth's physical state deteriorated, so did his ability to outrun the forces pursuing him. The net was closing in, Union soldiers tracking every lead, questioning every farmer, every sympathizer who might have seen the fugitive. And eventually, one of the men Booth trusted turned against him, providing crucial information that led federal troops directly to the assassin's final hiding place. A John Wilkes Booth and David Herold had managed to elude capture for nearly 2 weeks, moving through back roads, hiding in swamps, relying on sympathetic Confederate supporters to guide them along their escape route. But the noose was tightening. Union forces were tracking them with relentless determination. Their movements known to more people than Booth had anticipated, and the legend he had hoped to build for himself was crumbling in the face of a government unwilling to let him slip away. One of Booth's final helpers, a man who had briefly sheltered them during their desperate flight, decided to betray them, providing crucial information to federal agents that would lead to their capture. The tip pointed Union forces toward the Garrett farm in Virginia, where Booth and Herold had taken refuge in a small tobacco barn. hoping for a brief moment of rest before continuing their journey southward. As dawn approached, a contingent of Union soldiers surrounded the barn, their weapons ready, their orders clear. Booth was not to escape again. The standoff that followed would become the final act in Booth's violent, misguided rebellion, a moment that would determine whether he would stand trial, whether he would surrender, or whether he would die surrounded by the ashes of his own betrayal. Cornered inside the barn, Booth had nowhere left to run. The manhunt was over, and the assassin who had believed himself unstoppable now faced the full force of the Union's justice. John Wilkes Booth had spent 12 days on the run, fleeing deeper into the decaying remnants of the Confederate South, believing that somewhere in the ruins of war, he would find refuge, support, and validation for the assassination that had made him the most wanted man in America. But with each passing day, as Union forces tightened the noose around him, he began to realize the brutal truth. There was nowhere left to go. His body ached, his legs swollen and barely usable, and the Southern sympathizers he had expected to shelter him were hesitant, unwilling to risk their lives for a fugitive they had once admired. The tides had turned against him, and when he and his accomplice David Herold arrived at the Garrett farm in Virginia, he was no longer a Confederate hero. He was a hunted criminal, cornered in the last place he would ever see. The Garrett family agreed to let Booth and Herold stay, unaware at first of who they were and what they had done. The barn, a weathered wooden structure tucked away from the main road, became Booth's final refuge, and for a fleeting moment, he believed he had found a place to regain his strength and plan his next move. But by then, it was too late. Union forces were already closing in, their intelligence network unraveling every detail of his escape route, leading them straight to the fugitive's hiding place. In the early hours of April 26, 1865, Federal troops surrounded the Garrett farm, their rifles raised, their voices cutting through the stillness as they called out for Booth and Herold to surrender. Inside the barn, Booth stirred, the reality of his situation settling in. He was trapped. The soldiers outside would not leave without him, and unless he could find a way to escape, his life as a fugitive was over. He glanced at Herold, expecting his accomplice to stand firm, to face the same fate as him, but Herold was already faltering, his resolve breaking under the pressure of the soldiers waiting outside. The demands for surrender grew louder, and Booth, his pride unwilling to accept capture, refused. He would not be taken alive. He had always seen himself as a man of action, a figure shaped by the power of theatre, by grand gestures, by bold defiance, and in his mind, there was only one way for his story to end. With the same dramatic finality that had defined his reckless act of killing Lincoln. But Herold was no martyr. He had been a follower, not a leader, and now, faced with the certainty of death, he abandoned Booth, stepping forward and surrendering himself to the Union forces, leaving Booth alone in the barn, alone with his wounded body, alone with the inevitable fate he could not outrun. The soldiers hesitated only for a moment, then made their decision. The barn would be set ablaze, forcing Booth to make his choice: burn alive, or step into the open and face the consequences. Flames licked at the wooden beams, smoke poured into the air, and inside, Booth felt the fire closing in. It was the end, and the assassin who had taken Lincoln's life was now seconds away from losing his own. A John Wilkes Booth stood alone in the smoke-filled barn, surrounded by flames, his escape route cut off, his last refuge burning around him. David Herold had already surrendered, abandoning Booth to face his fate alone, unwilling to die alongside the man whose actions had sent the country into mourning. Booth, ever the dramatic figure, refused to give up. He clutched his rifle, his body trembling from exhaustion, from injury, from the realization that the chase was finally over. Outside, Union soldiers waited, their rifles trained on the barn. Watching the structure collapse into embers, the fire licking at the wooden beams. They had given Booth every opportunity to surrender. But he had spurned it, insisting he would fight, that he would die before being taken prisoner. Inside, coughing through the thick smoke, Booth stumbled, his fractured leg barely able to support him, his mind racing through every decision that had led him to this moment. He had believed that Lincoln's assassination would cement him as a hero in the South, that he would be welcomed as a Confederate savior. But now, trapped in this burning barn, hunted by the men who once saw him as nothing more than a performer, he understood the truth. He had been wrong. Then, in one final, decisive act, a soldier raised his rifle, took careful aim, and fired a single shot. The bullet tore through the barn, striking Booth in the neck, sending him crashing to the ground, his body paralyzed, his breath shallow. He had wished for a warrior's death, a dramatic last stand, but instead, he lay on the dirt, unable to move, his vision fading, his legacy dissolving into smoke and ash. Booth clung to life for several agonizing hours, whispering words few could understand, his voice weak and ragged. And then, as the morning light crept over the horizon, he took his final breath, the last act of his tragic performance reaching its inevitable conclusion. The flames rose higher, casting an eerie glow across the Virginia farmland as the wooden beams of the Garrett tobacco barn crackled under the heat. The fire, set by Union soldiers who surrounded the fugitive, crept through the dry timbers, swallowing the shadows where John Wilkes Booth had crouched, trapped, his back against the far wall, his breathing uneven, his escape route gone. He had refused to surrender, rejected the notion that he would face trial, stand before a jury, be remembered in chains instead of glory. But now, as the smoke thickened and the fire clawed closer, he saw his reality shrinking, saw that the end he had always envisioned, a rebel's triumph, a Confederate redemption, was never coming. Outside, Union soldiers waited, their rifles steady, their orders clear. Booth would not survive this night. David Herold, his fellow fugitive, had already surrendered. Stepping from the barn with hands raised, unwilling to die in flames, unwilling to sacrifice himself for Booth's doomed cause. And now, Booth remained alone, his body battered, his leg shattered, his future reduced to a few more agonizing minutes. As the fire began to engulf the barn, one soldier, Boston Corbett, saw Booth through the wooden slats, saw the assassin reaching for his rifle, still unwilling to surrender. A single shot rang out, piercing the chaos, the bullet slamming into Booth's neck, tearing through his spinal cord, severing the very movement that had carried him from Ford's Theater to the backwoods of Virginia. He collapsed instantly, his body crumpling onto the dirt, onto the burning hay beneath him, his breath stolen, his voice a ragged whisper. Soldiers rushed in, pulling Booth from the flames, dragging him into the open, placing him on the ground beneath the fading stars. But he was already lost, his limbs paralyzed, his eyes fluttering, his breathing shallow. He had wanted to die as a warrior, a martyr, but instead he lay helpless, incapable of lifting his head, incapable of moving a finger, incapable of resisting the cruel fate he had brought upon himself. The hours stretched into agony, Booth fading in and out of consciousness, the sounds of soldiers talking around him, the distant murmur of the dawn rising over the horizon, all blending into a final, cruel realization. He had failed. The South had not been saved, Lincoln had not been erased from history, and Booth had not become the legend he had convinced himself he would be. He moved his lips, tried to speak, tried to say something, anything, but only two words escaped him. Useless, useless. His final breath, his final thought, a whisper from the depths of regret. From the weight of knowing that everything he had believed in had collapsed in flames around him. And with those words, John Wilkes Booth was gone, his body limp, lifeless, the nation turning its eyes away from the fugitive and back to the man he had taken from them. Abraham Lincoln, the martyred president, the fallen leader, the man whose dream of unity would now live on beyond both blood and betrayal. John Wilkes Booth lay lifeless. His final words, useless, useless, barely a whisper in the darkness, before slipping into death's grasp, his once grand ambitions reduced to ash, regret, and failure. The manhunt had ended. But the echoes of Lincoln's assassination reverberated through the country, and the government was far from finished in its pursuit of justice. Booth had pulled the trigger, but he had not acted alone. A network of conspirators, individuals bound together by loyalty to the Confederate cause, by schemes whispered in the shadows, and by the belief that Lincoln's death would somehow serve their twisted vision of victory, had played their part. Now, the hunt shifted from Booth's body to those still alive, those who had helped plot the crime, those who had harbored him, those who had carried out their roles in the plan to assassinate not just Lincoln, but the Union's leadership itself. The first to face trial was David Herold, Booth's faithful companion in his doomed escape, the man who had ridden alongside him, hidden with him, and witnessed his slow decline into paranoia and agony. Unlike Booth, Herold had surrendered, stepping from the burning barn with his hands raised, choosing captivity over death, admitting his cowardice in the final moment. But surrender did not exempt him from justice. He had aided Booth's flight, had ensured the assassin had safe passage, and had failed to act against the crime, even when he knew its monstrous consequences. Then there was Lewis Powell, the brutal attacker, who had carried out the attempted murder of Secretary of State William Seward, storming into Seward's home armed with a blade, cutting down anyone who stood between him and his target. Though Seward had miraculously survived, Powell's rampage had left blood-soaked bodies in its wake, his merciless assault proving that the conspiracy had never simply been about Lincoln. It had aimed to dismantle the government entirely. George Atzerodt, the failed assassin tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson, also found himself dragged into the courtroom. His role in the conspiracy tainted not by violence, but by cowardice. Unlike Booth and Powell, Atzerodt had lacked the resolve to carry out his mission, instead drinking away his fear in a hotel bar, while history unfolded without him. But in the eyes of the law, failure was not innocence. He had agreed to murder a sitting vice president, and his hesitation had not absolved him of guilt. The conspirators, now prisoners, faced a military tribunal. Their trial held in Washington, D.C., where the weight of Lincoln's death hung over the proceedings like an executioner's blade. The government had no desire for leniency. This was a moment for swift, decisive justice. Evidence was presented in overwhelming detail. Witness testimonies painted vivid portraits of their crimes, and soon, the verdict was unmistakable. They would hang for their betrayal, their conspiracy, their role in the most infamous assassination in American history. The gallows were constructed, and on July 7, 1865, justice was carried out with merciless finality. 4 conspirators, David Herold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt, the woman who had harbored Booth during the planning of the attack, were led to their deaths, the weight of their crimes ensuring that history would not forget the price they paid for their treason. The trapdoors opened, the ropes snapped tight, and with their last breath, Lincoln's assassins met the fate they had so ruthlessly deserved. But even as the executions took place, Lincoln's legacy had already transcended the tragedy. His death had sealed his place among the immortal figures of American history, a leader who had united a divided nation and left behind a vision that no assassin's bullet could erase. The trial of the Lincoln assassination conspirators was swift, decisive, and unforgiving, held in a military courtroom in Washington, D.C., with the weight of justice pressing down on each defendant. The government, determined to punish those responsible for the crime that had shaken the nation, moved aggressively, ensuring that the conspirators would face the highest possible consequences. Unlike civilian trials, the military tribunal offered no leniency, no allowances for appeals that might delay the inevitable. And the men and women accused of assisting John Wilkes Booth in his plot knew that their fate had already been sealed. The prosecution wasted no time in building its case, presenting an overwhelming amount of evidence. Eyewitness testimonies, letters linking the accused to Booth, and details of their actions in the days leading up to Lincoln's murder. Lewis Powell, the brutal attacker who had stormed Secretary of State William Seward's home, was painted as a merciless, bloodthirsty accomplice, his violent assault leaving multiple victims wounded and ensuring that he would not escape the gallows. David Herold, Booth's traveling companion and a key figure in his escape through the South, was marked as a willing participant in Booth's attempt to evade capture, making him just as guilty as the assassin himself. George Atzerodt, whose cowardice prevented him from carrying out his role in assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson, did not escape justice simply because he failed. His involvement in the conspiracy was enough to secure his execution, ensuring that even hesitation did not grant him mercy. And then there was Mary Surratt, the woman who had harbored Booth and his co-conspirators, allowing them to meet at her boarding house, helping them store weapons, offering her home as the foundation for their treacherous plans. The court deliberated briefly, but there was no doubt the sentences were harsh, the punishments unavoidable. On July 7, 1865, 4 conspirators, Powell, Herold, Atzerodt, and Surratt, were led to their deaths, climbing the scaffold, where they would meet their fate beneath the noose. As the trapdoors opened, history was made. Mary Surratt became the first woman ever executed by the US government. Her silent figure dangling beside the men she had conspired with, forever marking her name as part of Lincoln's tragic end. Mary Surratt stood on the gallows, her figure draped in black mourning cloth, her face stern yet pale, her fate sealed by history's unforgiving hand. The July heat pressed down on the courtyard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary, where she and 3 of her fellow conspirators, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt, awaited their final moments. Soldiers lined the perimeter, their expressions unreadable, while spectators watched in solemn silence, knowing they were about to witness an execution that would mark a grim milestone in American history. The first woman ever sentenced to death by the United States government. Surratt's involvement in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy had been shrouded in debate, with some arguing she had been a central figure in its planning, while others believed she had only unknowingly assisted Booth and his men. unaware of their ultimate intentions. But her boarding house had served as a meeting ground for the conspirators, and she had helped arrange weapons and supplies for Booth's escape, cementing her role as an accomplice in the nation's darkest crime. President Andrew Johnson, firm in his belief that she had played an integral part, refused all requests for clemency, ensuring her place among the condemned. As the newses were prepared, Surratt stood alongside Powell, Herold, and Atzerodt, each prisoner's hands bound. Their faces, streaked with sweat, the atmosphere thick with the weight of their impending deaths. Priests murmured prayers, offering final words of absolution to those who wished to receive them. Powell, the most unapologetic of the group, remained cold-faced, refusing to show remorse for his violent attack on Secretary of State William Seward. Atzerodt, shaking, muttered regrets about his cowardice, while Herold barely spoke at all, too consumed by terror to find his voice. At exactly 1:25 p.m., the trapdoors opened beneath them, and the four conspirators dropped, their bodies jerking as the ropes snapped tight, their lives extinguished in a single, brutal moment. The execution was swift, decisive, and final. Justice for Lincoln's murder had now been fully delivered, but not all conspirators met death that day. Others, like Dr. Samuel Mudd, who had treated Booth's injured leg during his escape, and Edward Spangler, who had assisted Booth at Ford's Theatre, were sentenced to imprisonment. Locked away in remote military facilities, their lives spared, but forever tainted by their involvement in Lincoln's tragic end. The nation had punished those responsible, but the wounds left behind by the president's assassination would linger for generations to come. The execution of Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt on July 7, 1865, marked the final reckoning for the core conspirators in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Their bodies dangling from the gallows, their lives extinguished in a single brutal moment, as witnesses stood in solemn silence, watching justice, or vengeance, unfold. But not all who had played a role in the conspiracy met death that day. Others were spared the hangman's noose, though their fate remained grim, as imprisonment became their punishment, their names forever stained by the crime they had aided, directly or indirectly. Among them was Dr. Samuel Mudd, the physician who had treated Booth's fractured leg during his escape, a decision that sealed his reputation as a conspirator. Though he vehemently denied knowing Booth had assassinated the president at the time of treatment, Mudd was sentenced to life in prison, sent to Fort Jefferson in the dry Tortugas, where he would spend years in isolation, his name synonymous with betrayal, even as debates raged over whether he had truly been guilty, or simply a man who made a fateful mistake. Others imprisoned included Michael O'Loughlin, who had conspired with Booth in earlier plans to kidnap Lincoln, and Edward Spangler, a stagehand at Ford's Theatre, who had helped Booth flee moments after the fatal gunshot, each sentenced to varying terms behind bars, their futures now shadowed by association with the most infamous assassination in American history. As the conspirators' fates were sealed, a new battle began, not with weapons, but with words, arguments, and heated discussions on whether the military trials had been fair, or fueled by the sheer rage of a grieving nation. Many questioned whether justice had truly been served, or whether vengeance had overtaken reason, leading to rushed verdicts, harsh sentences, and the execution of individuals who may have played lesser roles than originally believed. Mary Surratt's execution, in particular, drew controversy, with many arguing that she had been a scapegoat for the crime, that her boarding house had provided shelter for Booth's conspiracy, but she had never actively participated in the assassination plot. The government, however, had been unwavering. Surratt's connection to Booth and her assistance in preparing supplies for his escape were enough to prove her guilt, and she became the first woman executed by the US government, a milestone that fueled bitter debates on whether her death had been necessary or cruelly symbolic. The arguments stretched beyond the trial room and into political circles, where Lincoln's assassination had become more than just the murder of a president. It had become a symbol of the struggle between North and South, a reminder of the wounds of war, a test of the limits of justice versus retribution. Some believed the trials had been swift, but necessary, that the conspirators had knowingly participated in Booth's treacherous act, and the price of such betrayal had to be steep. Others felt the use of a military tribunal, rather than a civilian court, had robbed the accused of a proper defense. That fear of further rebellion had motivated the executions, rather than clear legal reasoning. Regardless of the opinions that followed, the events had now become irreversible. Lincoln was dead, his assassins either hanged or locked away in distant prisons, and the debate over their fates would linger for years. But one truth remained. Booth's bullet had changed the course of American history, and whether the punishment that followed had been truly just or veiled in political vengeance, it had ensured that those who had conspired against the Union's leader would never see freedom again. The aftermath of the Lincoln assassination trials left the country divided, not in war, as it had been for years, but in opinion. The swift execution of Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt, and the imprisonment of others, had delivered what many believed to be justice, yet doubts and suspicions lingered. Had the trial truly served justice, or had it been a product of political revenge, fueled by the Union's need to punish those linked to Booth, regardless of their level of involvement? Historians and legal experts would argue both sides for decades. Supporters of the verdict maintained that all those convicted had played direct roles in the conspiracy, ensuring Booth had the means to carry out his attack, to escape, to attempt further chaos within the Union government. They believed the military tribunal had been the appropriate response, given the nature of the crime, a coordinated assassination attempt on multiple government officials during wartime. In the very heart of Washington, Lincoln had been a wartime president, and his murder, they argued, was not just a crime, but an act of treason, warranting the full weight of military justice. But others, particularly those sympathetic to the South, viewed the trial as less about justice and more about retribution. The Confederate States had already lost the war. Their soldiers had surrendered, their political leaders had been forced into exile, prison, or disgrace. And now, with Lincoln's death, the Union was using his assassination as a means to eradicate even the remnants of Confederate loyalty. The trial, some believed, had been rushed, built upon circumstantial evidence in some cases, with limited access to fair defense attorneys, ensuring that the accused had little hope of surviving the courtroom, regardless of their true level of guilt. And beyond the debates over justice versus vengeance, a darker question lingered in the minds of historians and investigators. Was the Lincoln assassination truly the work of Booth and his conspirators alone? Or had it been orchestrated by a larger, more powerful force? One that reached deep into the remnants of the Confederate government. Theories soon emerged, speculating that Booth had not acted alone, not truly, and that his plan was part of a broader effort, possibly funded or supported by former Confederate officials, desperate to strike back at the Union, even after their military defeat. Some believed Booth had received financial backing from secret Southern networks, while others speculated that the plan to assassinate Lincoln had been discussed in Confederate circles long before Booth ever became involved. But with the war over, the Confederate leadership dismantled, and Booth dead, these theories remained unproven, locked in speculation rather than confirmed evidence. The mystery surrounding Lincoln's murder, however, ensured that the questions would never fully disappear, leaving historians and researchers to piece together fragments of what could have been a deeper, hidden conspiracy. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was widely seen as the final violent echo of the Civil War, an act carried out by a single man, John Wilkes Booth, and his network of conspirators. But as the dust settled and Booth lay lifeless after his doomed escape, questions arose. Was this truly just Booth's plan? Or was he a pawn in something much larger? For years, historians have debated whether there was deeper Confederate involvement, speculating that Booth may have been funded, encouraged, or even directed by powerful figures within the remnants of the defeated Southern leadership. Booth himself had strong ties to Confederate supporters, spending time in Southern cities, meeting with individuals who still harbored hope for rebellion, despite the war's inevitable conclusion. Some theories suggest that Booth was not acting alone in the true sense, not just as a rogue assassin, fueled by personal resentment, but as a tool of a larger plot, a final act of revenge orchestrated by desperate Confederate loyalists. One of the most controversial theories points to Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederate States, as possibly being linked to Lincoln's murder, or at the very least, aware of Booth's intentions before the event unfolded. But did Davis actually play a direct role? Or was Booth simply inspired by the dying cause of the Confederacy, acting in his own reckless, misguided pursuit of justice for the South? That question remains one of the lingering mysteries surrounding Lincoln's assassination. The question of whether John Wilkes Booth acted alone, or whether his plot was linked to deeper Confederate involvement, has haunted historians for more than a century. Booth himself, a fervent Southern sympathizer, had spent months crafting his plan, first considering kidnapping Lincoln, then escalating his scheme into outright murder, believing that eliminating the president and key government officials would spark a Confederate resurgence. But the sheer boldness of the act, the precision with which Booth executed his escape, and the connections he maintained with known Confederate sympathizers have led many to wonder. Was Booth true the mastermind behind it all? Or was he being guided, funded, or encouraged by higher powers within the crumbling Confederate government? One of the most debated figures in this mystery is Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, who had spent the final days of the war moving from city to city, watching his government collapse around him. Some historians and investigators have speculated that Davis may have had knowledge of a plot against Lincoln, or at the very least, been aware that Confederate loyalists were seeking revenge against the Union's leadership. The argument stems from the fact that Davis was still leading remnants of the Confederate government in exile, surrounded by individuals desperate for a final strike against the Union. Booth himself had frequented Southern circles, met with wealthy Confederate supporters, and had spoken openly about his desire to eliminate Lincoln long before the assassination. Could it be possible that powerful figures within the South had encouraged him, knowing he was reckless enough to carry out such a daring attack? Some evidence suggests that Booth may have received financial backing from individuals in Confederate intelligence networks, though direct links to Davis remain largely circumstantial. After Lincoln's assassination, Union officials searched extensively for proof of broader Southern involvement, hoping to tie the crime to the highest ranks of the defeated Confederacy. Some investigators believed that the assassination may have been discussed among secret Confederate factions, but definitive proof never emerged. Booth's own writings indicate that he saw himself as a lone avenger, a man striking down Lincoln for personal reasons as much as political ones. While it is plausible that Davis or Confederate sympathizers may have known Booth was planning something, there is no evidence to suggest they directly ordered Lincoln's assassination. Regardless of whether Booth had Confederate backing, his crime had far-reaching consequences that extended far beyond his own misguided ambitions. It reshaped the course of Reconstruction, altered the future of racial justice, and changed American history forever. Lincoln had envisioned a post-war America built on unity, one where former Confederates would be reintegrated into society, and freed slaves would receive full legal protection and civil rights. His assassination dealt a devastating blow to that vision, creating an atmosphere of bitterness, political division, and renewed hostility between the North and South. With Lincoln's death, his successor, Andrew Johnson, took over, but Johnson lacked Lincoln's ability to navigate the fragile post-war landscape. Instead of pushing for a bold Reconstruction plan that would ensure racial equality and full citizenship for freed slaves, Johnson allowed Southern states to rebuild without strict federal oversight, leading to a resurgence of oppression, racist laws, and white supremacist movements that would shape the next century of American history. Had Lincoln lived, the course of Reconstruction might have been vastly different, as his leadership would have ensured a stronger federal push toward racial justice. His assassination robbed America of the possibility of a more unified, progressive post-war future, and instead deepened the wounds between North and South, ensuring that the war's bitterness lingered long after the last shot had been fired. Booth may have believed that his actions would resurrect the Confederacy, but in reality, he had doomed it further. His bullet not only killed Lincoln, but also solidified the North's determination to prevent any future Southern uprising, ensuring that the war's outcome would never be reversed. His crime became a grim lesson in the power of hate and misplaced ideals, a warning that political violence only deepened the divisions it sought to erase. Even today, Lincoln's assassination remains one of the greatest turning points in American history, altering the nation's trajectory in ways Booth never could have anticipated. Abraham Lincoln's assassination did more than shock a grieving nation. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of Reconstruction, ensuring that the post-war period would be defined not by Lincoln's vision of unity, but by political conflict, racial oppression, and deepening divides between North and South. Lincoln had intended to guide the country through its fragile recovery, believing that reconciliation, rather than punishment, was the best path forward. He had spoken of welcoming the South back into the Union, offering a fair but firm process to rebuild the nation, ensuring that newly freed slaves would be protected under the law, and preventing radical revenge policies that would deepen resentment. But his murder at the hands of John Wilkes Booth destroyed those hopes, leaving a nation unsure of how to move forward without its leader, and replacing Lincoln's steady hand with the unpredictable leadership of Andrew Johnson. Johnson, a Southern Democrat, lacked Lincoln's ability to unite, and while he publicly claimed to continue Lincoln's work, his actions quickly undermined the potential for true racial justice. He granted generous pardons to former Confederate leaders, allowing many to return to positions of power, and resisted efforts by Congress to protect freed slaves from the brutality of Southern backlash. Instead of ensuring equality, Reconstruction under Johnson allowed the rise of racist laws, black codes, and violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who terrorized newly freed African Americans. Had Lincoln lived, Reconstruction would have likely followed a different path, one rooted in enforcing civil rights, holding the South accountable for its past, and ensuring that America emerged from the war stronger, rather than fractured. But his assassination robbed the nation of that chance, ensuring that political battles between Congress and the presidency would drag on, preventing meaningful change for decades to come. Yet, even as Reconstruction spiraled into chaos, Lincoln's legacy grew beyond the limitations of history. His memory evolved, transforming him into a hero, a martyr, a savior of the Union, a man whose life and death cemented him as one of the most revered figures in American history. Even today, Lincoln stands as an immortal symbol, embodying the ideals of freedom, democracy, and justice. His name forever tied to America's struggle to define itself. Abraham Lincoln's death did not end his influence. It magnified it, transforming him into a legend, a martyr, a figure whose legacy would endure far beyond his years in office. Before his assassination, Lincoln had already secured his place in history as the president who guided the nation through its bloodiest war, but his tragic death ensured that he would be remembered not only as a leader, but as a symbol of sacrifice, justice, and the enduring strength of democracy. In the immediate aftermath of his murder, Lincoln's memory was elevated to near mythic status. His speeches, once rallying cries for Union soldiers, became sacred texts, studied not just for their political wisdom, but for their moral clarity. The words of the Gettysburg Address, his second inaugural address, and countless personal letters were read and reread, woven into the fabric of American identity. The man who had once faced relentless criticism from both political allies and enemies now stood as a revered figure, untouched by partisan debate, his name uttered with respect, his image immortalized in portraits, monuments, and textbooks. And while Lincoln's legacy as the great emancipator was already secured, his assassination solidified his role as a martyr for freedom. A president who gave his life for the vision of a united country, free from slavery and division. Across the North, cities erected statues, songs were written in his honor, and ordinary citizens held vigils, recognizing that his death had been more than just a national tragedy. It had been a turning point in America's identity. Yet, while Lincoln became the ultimate symbol of justice, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, became the tragic embodiment of misguided hatred. Booth had believed that killing Lincoln would save the South, restore its glory, and avenge its defeat in the Civil War. But instead, his act only cemented Lincoln's place as an American saint, ensuring that he would be forever admired, while Booth would be forever condemned. Booth had dreamed of freeing the South, of making Lincoln's death a rallying cry for Confederate resistance. Yet all he had done was seal the South's fate in history as the defeated side, ensuring that Lincoln's legacy would outlive every Southern general, every Confederate leader, every man who had fought against him. In death, Lincoln became a force too great to be erased, his image shaping not just Reconstruction, but the very future of American democracy itself. Booth had hoped to kill a tyrant, but instead, he had created a saint, a man whose presence lingers in every discussion of freedom, unity, and the moral battle between hatred and justice. Lincoln's immortality was not forged in his presidency alone, but in the tragic moment when his life was taken. And yet, his vision lived on. John Wilkes Booth believed that he would be remembered as a Southern savior, the man who had struck down the tyrant, Abraham Lincoln, paving the way for the Confederacy to rise again, reclaim its lost honor, and reject the Union's vision of America. But history was never kind to Booth, and instead of freeing the South, he sealed its fate. And in doing so, he elevated Lincoln from a man into something far greater. Before the assassination, Lincoln had been controversial, admired by many, but also criticized by his opponents, both in the North and South. His leadership during the Civil War was not always universally supported, and even within Union circles, he faced political battles, accusations of overreach, and resistance to his policies. But Booth's bullet did something that no speech, no battlefield victory, no act of legislation ever could. It turned Lincoln into a martyr, a figure above politics, a man whose death purified his legacy. With Lincoln's murder, the nation no longer saw him as merely a president, but as a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and justice. His image transformed from that of a wartime leader into that of a saintly figure, someone whose life and death became woven into the very spirit of American identity. Booth, in his anger, had hoped to erase Lincoln's influence, but in reality, he made him immortal. In the years that followed, Lincoln's memory was shaped by both history and mythology, his legacy growing beyond the man himself, beyond even the country he once led. He was no longer just the 16th president. He was the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the fallen leader whose vision outlived both war and treachery. His words gained a sacred quality. His speeches became timeless declarations of American ideals, and his face was carved into stone, painted in portraits, printed on currency, recognized across the world. Booth had wanted Lincoln erased, but instead he made him eternal. The assassin became a villain, a cautionary tale of hatred, while Lincoln rose beyond the limitations of time, becoming not just a man, but a legend. Abraham Lincoln's transformation from man to legend was not simply the result of his presidency. It was the impact of his life, his death, and the ideals he left behind, carried forward by the nation he fought so hard to save. When John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger in Ford's Theater, he believed he was striking a blow for the Confederacy, for Southern honor, for the defeat of Lincoln's vision. But in reality, he elevated Lincoln beyond politics, beyond war, beyond history itself. Lincoln became immortalized not just as the great emancipator, but as America's moral compass, the president whose wisdom, humility, and sacrifice defined the very soul of the nation. His words continued to resonate, shaping generations to come. His speeches became national scripture. His face became carved into stone. His memory became untouchable. He was no longer just a leader, a wartime strategist, or a political figure. He was a legend, a presence that would forever watch over American democracy. Through the decades, Lincoln's name remained synonymous with justice, unity, and perseverance. His death had been a tragedy, but his legacy became a guiding light, ensuring that America would never forget the values he stood for. He was admired by presidents, scholars, citizens, his story told and retold in classrooms, books, and memorials. Even those who had once doubted him came to revere him, recognizing that in the darkest chapter of American history, Lincoln had been the one man who stood firm, who led with resolve, who never wavered in his belief that a divided nation could be made whole again. And in the end, Booth's crime did not erase Lincoln. It only ensured that he would never be forgotten. Now, after all this history, all this drama, all this legend, you should go to bed, kick off your boots, wrap yourself in that blanket like it's the flag of freedom, and rest easy knowing you just took a deep dive into one of America's greatest stories. Close your eyes, dream of history, and tomorrow, wake up ready to make some of your own. Sleep tight.